A unique doc for sure. Selected 16 times by his peers as a member of the best doctors in America. Ken Brummel Smith, MD, is Professor Emeritus Department of Geriatrics at Florida State University College of Medicine. In this episode of Pause for Purpose, join Dr. Brummel Smith as he shares updates on COVID vaccines, the good and bad news, plus insights into vaccine hesitancy.
We have the distinct privilege and pleasure of introducing Ken Brummel Smith, who is not only a physician, Professor Emeritus from the Department of Geriatrics, Florida State University College of Medicine. I could spend this hour going through this man's accolades. They are that rich and that deep. However, just some highlights for those of you who aren't familiar. He served as chief of the Division of Geriatrics at two medical schools, one at USC, University of Southern California, and the Oregon Health Sciences University. Co-editor or author of 5 textbooks, written numerous book chapters and articles in the area of geriatrics, ethics, and geriatric rehabilitation. Been selected 16 times by his peers as a member of the best doctors in America. Member of the National Advisory Council on Aging for the National Institute on Aging, and a Health and Aging Policy Fellow for the Senate Special Committee on Aging in Washington. Past president of the American Geriatric Society, served on Aging, Disability, and Independence Forum of the National Academy of Medicine. He's a graduate of University of Southern California, where he also did his residency, School of Medicine, also did his residency there and a fellowship. He retired from Florida State University in 2017, is obviously very busy, has been since, and he loves cycling, hiking, time for Rotary, consulting, and get this one, pickleball. Ken informed me that that's the new upcoming thing, and we should do a Pause for Purpose program on pickleball, which because of Ken, we're going to do at some point in the future. So with no further ado, Vicki and I are both thrilled to introduce Ken Brummel Smith, and he's going to speak today. We're going to start with a few questions so that you can all get filled in on the early years, and then I'm going to turn it over to Ken to really talk about what a lot of us are interested in, which is this whole COVID and vaccine environment. So first of all, welcome, Ken. And
thank you.
We want to know, to start out, where did you spend childhood, growing up, teen years, undergraduate education, and was science and medicine something that was always an interest of yours? And if you can just talk about those early years, and did your experiences and choices lead you to this whole field of geriatrics, or did that come later? So it's all yours.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here with all of you, especially I see some of my friends from the society here too, so it's great to have you.
Yeah.
I was born in Texas, and my parents were very young. My mother and father had to get married because she was pregnant with me. And so we started off very poor, and my dad worked very hard in a variety of different jobs as a 17, 18, 19-year-old. And finally, he got a chance to go to University of Texas and was a stellar student, and ended up getting drawn into the aerospace industry because he was a mathematician. And at those days, they built airplanes with slide rules. And so he kept getting recruited away because he had always been used to kind of a poor life. Anybody would offer him a new job at a higher pay, and he'd move us. So we moved all over. I lived in Southern California in Anaheim. I lived in Kent, Washington, right outside Seattle, in Corvallis, in Texas. I went to 9 different schools in the first 12 years of my schooling. So it was like being in the military in a way. But we ended up settling in Southern California, where I went to high school and then college at Loyola and then med school at USC. And that was in the 60s. And so I was in the counterculture, and the counterculture specialty in those days was family medicine. That was a new specialty. There had always been general practitioners, but family medicine was now a residency-based training. And so naturally, as a counterculture person, I went into that one. But I also really loved the whole concept of treating the whole person and treating the family as a unit of care. And I knew also I wanted to be a teacher because I had a very influential biology teacher in high school, Mr. Adenovirus, who had been a frustrated medical student himself and had to drop out of med school. And so I was in med school and pursuing family medicine, and I went through a family medicine residency. And when I got into family medicine, I was struck by, and especially in those days, older people were very, well, still are, it was very much discriminated against within the medical system. And it always felt uncomfortable, but I didn't really know why. It was always framed, and there's nothing you can do for them anyway. Can't cure anything that they have. And so when I was in family medicine and a young faculty member, my program boss said, I think the Society of Teachers are holding a conference in Boston, speaking of the Boston people, on teaching geriatrics in a family medicine residency. And I think this is going to be a big deal someday. This was 1980. And so I'd like you to go and hear what they have to say. And my first thought was, ooh, a free trip to Boston. I didn't have any interest in geriatrics, really. But I went there and I saw this Venn diagram, you know, the three circles that are together. And it was biology, psychology, and social. And where they intersected was function. And the concept in geriatrics is we may not be able to cure people's problems, but we can help them function better. And that in reality, that's what older people cared about the most anyway, living as independent as possible, functioning at their highest level as possible, those sorts of things. So this literally was a light bulb going off for me. I just thought, that's it. And I switched gears and I did a fellowship at UCLA in geriatrics, and I just totally got into geriatrics and moved away from doing regular, not completely, but mostly away from doing regular family medicine. And it seems like my career has always been attended by changes that are fortuitous, because that was fortuitous. And then after I was back at my residency teaching for 3 years, I was starting to think, well, maybe I'll go back and do a fellowship in geriatrics now. The first one had been in medical education. And so I called a friend of mine at Rancho Los Amigos, which is the largest rehab hospital in the world in Downey, California, as part of the USC teaching system. And I said, Mike, I'm thinking of going back and doing a fellowship in geriatrics now. And he goes, well, why do you want to do that? You've been doing geriatrics 3 years now since you got back from that conference. You know a lot. Why don't you come here and be the director? I'm leaving. So I applied for and got the job to be the director of the clinical gerontology service, it was called, at Rancho. And that again was like an 8-year education for me, because nobody was really doing rehab for geriatrics. They were doing rehab for stroke or spinal cord injury. So we had 2 age-based programs in the hospital, geriatric rehab and pediatric rehab. And it was, Rancho is very well known internationally as a research-oriented hospital. So we just did tons of research on geriatric rehabilitation. And it really, for me, was the establishment of my academic career. And during this time, my wife, who's also a physician, and I decided to have a child. We've been married 17 years already, and we always say we procrastinated for 17 years. And so we had a 1.5-year-old, and I was living in Pasadena, and there was a drive-by shooting nearby. And, you know, I thought back to my kid days and growing up in Austin, Texas, and being surrounded by forests. And I thought, I'd rather raise a child in the forest than in LA. So I looked on the map as to, is really before internet days, where are medical schools where there are forests surrounding them? And so I settled on Oregon and Albuquerque. And one day I was at a geriatric conference, and I asked a friend of mine who was one of the fathers of geriatrics, do you know John Walsh? He had been the editor of a textbook that I'd written a chapter for, but I hadn't worked with him directly. And he goes, oh yeah, I know John well. I said, well, introduce me if you see him, because I'm thinking I'd like to try and move to Oregon. 5 minutes later, he taps on my shoulder and, hey, I'd like you to meet John Walsh. And I said, well, John, I'm thinking I'd like to move to Oregon if possible. And so if a job ever opens up there, let me know. And he says, when would you like to come? So I moved to Oregon and was there for 8 years. And I was actually only at Oregon Health Sciences for 4. And I was had been asked to be on the board for a PACE program of all-inclusive care of the elderly, which is a incredible organization all around the country now for providing care to frail elders. And so the sister of the Providence Health System who ran that said, we're going to run a national search for a program director for a center on aging at Providence. And would you lead this search? And I said, I think I might be interested in that job. So I applied and got that job and moved over to Providence. And that was a terrific experience. And then around 8 years later, I was at an American Geriatric Society conference again. And one of my friends said, have you heard about that new medical school in Florida? It's going to be kind of a family medicine oriented medical school, and they're searching for a chair of a department of geriatrics. And as Joyce said, I'd been the chief of divisions of geriatrics in the Department of Medicine, but never a chair. And I thought, wow, well, this could be kind of cool. So I interviewed and got that job, and we moved to Florida, and that's where I was for 12 years, 15 years altogether, because I stepped out of the chair for the last 3 years, the time I was there. So all of my moves seem to have been almost accidental, but always welcomed. It was a great experience.
Okay, so you have this distinguished and illustrious career now in medicine spanning decades. You retired from Florida State in 2017. Describe the last few years, and it would segue into along came the pandemic and COVID and the whole unfolding story with the vaccines. So we're really curious now to hear about the more recent chapter of the past few years. And then if you could segue right into discussing what's going on with the vaccines and the issues that are about trusting them and hesitancy to use them, et cetera. And just think in terms of 15, 20 minutes. And then I know folks are going to have questions. And so we'll have a lot of time for Q&A.
Okay. Well, when I retired, I knew I wanted to be doing a bunch of things that I had never had time to do before. And so I started off right away by finding a Sprinter van that was cargo model, meaning completely empty inside, and spending the next about 6 months building it out inside for camping. I was doing a lot of cycling in Florida, and so I wanted it to be able to carry my bicycles, and I've always liked camping and climbing. So that was, and I've always loved to do woodworking, but never had the time to do it. So I really spent a lot of time, especially with the help of YouTube, learning how to do woodworking and build cabinets and those sorts of things. And that's also when I first discovered pickleball. And pickleball was a great geriatric experience for me because I had been regularly playing racquetball for probably almost 30 years. And I loved playing racquetball at FSU because all these 20-something kids would come in, and we had these big, there were 2 rooms that were the challenge rooms that had a big glass wall that you could watch the play. And so they'd see this old bald guy who was playing, and they'd think, oh, well, I'm going to go and get him out so I can play one of my buddies. And it was fun because once you're old and you've learned how to play racquetball, you learn to wait instead of trying to run around fast. So you wait and wait and wait and hit the ball at the last minute and kill it, and they lose. So I always liked beating the college students. But when I had been on the board for the Tallahassee Senior Center, and I kept always hearing about pickleball and how enthused everybody was about it, but I never had time to go and play because it was always during the day. And so after I was retired, I went over to play, and I walk into the senior center, and here's all these old people, and they're all, not all, many are overweight, hobbling with bad knees and things. And I thought, God, this is going to be so easy to play here. And even though I really didn't know how to play very well, and I just got creamed. They were so good, so skillful, even though they had these mobility problems. They knew how to predict what the ball was going to do, and it was just a real humbling experience. But I also fell in love with it, so I really got into playing that. And then we all also knew we really, I didn't enjoy Florida that much. I have to admit, I'm a raving liberal, and so being in a very conservative state didn't work for me. And so we had wanted to move to Mount Shasta, which is in far northern California on the side of a 14,000-foot mountain for a long time. So we made the move here, and immediately I started getting involved in other kinds of community activities. Like I'm now a board member for the Parks and Recreation District and on the Rotary Board and those sorts of things. So I have gotten very, very busy, more busy than I thought I was going to be, but uh, not so busy that I can't play lots of pickleball when I want to as well. But of course, the pandemic, one of the things I started doing in Florida State was every year we'd go to Panama and do a medical mission trip up in the mountains. And while we were there in March of 2019, the pandemic started. And we almost didn't make it back because they closed the borders after that. But it got me very interested in studying about it. So I've just been studying and reading everything I can about it just because I think it's so amazing, and was fortunate to do some consulting for USC. One of my former students was the dean at USC School of Medicine, and she hired me to run Zoom groups with her faculty because they were stressed out. And so it was a really great but hard experience. And but I learned a ton. So I've just been trying to keep up with it, and any new things that come out. And one of the things I've loved in medicine is trying to be able to translate what's going on in medicine into terms that normal people can understand. So I've always told doctors every time I had a first year class in med school, I'd say, well, you look about as abnormal as any first year class I've ever seen. And they'd all kind of bristle and say, well, think about it. You know, you've chosen to spend your life with sick people, and most people run away from sick people. So you're not normal. Your patients are normal. You're the abnormal one. Don't forget it. So that's kind of my theory or philosophy behind learning about COVID, how to translate it into normal people's talk. So Joyce and Vicki had asked me to talk about the vaccine. I had done for the other group, one of the other groups Joyce and Vicki are in, called the Society, a more general talk about the virus itself and how it infects us and that sort of thing. And that might be good to do sometime too, if people want to learn about that. But the vaccine is on everybody's mind right now. I've gotten one of my 2 vaccines so far. I'm in the second group, 65 plus, no serious illnesses. And as you probably know, there are 2 vaccines that are generally available right now, although soon there's going to be a third one. And we can talk about the differences. And I do have some slides I could show if there were questions that were specific or would help illustrate the facts about it more easily. But these are really interesting vaccines because they're the first ones that have been mass produced. It's not a new technology. It's been around for 10 years, but there hasn't been mass production of this type of vaccine ever before. And the way that it works is, as you probably know, the coronavirus is what's called an mRNA, or messenger RNA virus. Viruses are amazing things. They're basically packets of genetic material inside a protein coat, a protein and lipid coat. And that's all. They're not alive. What they do is they get into our body and they take over the genetic machinery, usually the DNA, of our bodies, and start wreaking havoc. And the coronavirus is a messenger RNA virus. So what it does is it has these things called spike proteins, which literally are proteins that stick out like spikes on it. And those spike proteins happen to connect to a particular receptor in our bodies. And we all have different kinds of receptors. The particular receptor this one connects to is called an ACE2 receptor, which is also important in blood pressure. And once it connects, then that opens the lock and allows the messenger RNA of the virus to go inside the cell and take over the cell's making of proteins, and they make more viruses. And then those viruses destroy the cell and are released, tens of thousands of viruses per cell. And then those viruses can be spewed out when we cough or we sneeze onto other people, and that's how it's transmitted. So they ingeniously thought the way to fight this one, now I should say, typically the vaccines you're used to are actually either a bacteria or a virus that's been killed. And then parts of the dead virus or dead vaccine are given into us with a shot. And our bodies recognize, hey, this is foreign stuff, foreign protein usually. And then the body's immune system starts making antibodies that fight that particular protein, or white blood cells, which go and eat up the bacteria or the viruses. So that's how immunity works. The way the spike protein works is it allows you to connect to the cell to open the lock to let the virus get in the cell. So if you can block the spike protein from working, then it can't infect the cells. And so what they did was they genetically engineered out of the messenger RNA, which is 80,000 pairs, or not pairs actually, because messenger RNA, DNA is two pairs that are connected. RNA is just one side of that. So 80,000 nucleotides, they're called, on one strand. And part of that is what makes the spike protein. They found that part and they replicated it. And then they take that and they put it inside, someone called it a butter, like a butter envelope, a lipid coating. Why? Because cells like to eat butter. And so as soon as this butter-coated mRNA comes into you with the shot, your cells recognize it, eat it, and it gets in the body, in the cells, not in the nucleus, only in the outside part of the cell. And it says, make the spike protein. So it's not making the virus, it's just making that spike protein. The spike protein is released and the body says, hey, this is foreign, and it makes antibodies. And so this is why it works as a vaccine, is because it makes your body produce antibodies. Now, why is that important? I've said this before, and I always feel weird about it because doctors are known for gallows humor kind of thing, but we do appreciate when nature, through evolution, when nature creates amazing things. And this virus is an amazing virus. It is so efficient at infecting us and even killing us with multiple different reasons that we could talk about. But it gets into the body so easily because the body doesn't recognize it. And so because it doesn't recognize it, since we don't have natural antibodies to it, then it's very easy for it to get in and give you three states that you can be in. You could either just be carrying it around where it never actually infects you. Your body doesn't even recognize it as foreign. So you wouldn't have antibodies. We don't know what the carrier rate is. Or one of the most common things and why it's so efficient at harming people is that up to 40, maybe 50% of people who get infected have no symptoms. It's called asymptomatic. But you still make the antibodies. Well, what's interesting is the degree of infection you have is related to the amount of antibodies you make. So if you're asymptomatic, you make enough to get over it eventually, but you don't make a lot of antibodies. If you're mildly infected, which is about, of the 60% who get sick, about 40% of them get mildly sick. They make more antibodies than asymptomatic, but not that much. If you get moderately, which is about 20% of the 60% who get sick. They make more antibodies, but not as much as someone who gets severely ill. So the only way to get a lot of antibodies, a lot of immunity, is to get severely ill, which means you have a big chance of dying. And so this is a terrible infection because the only way to really get good immunity is to almost die.
Mm.
And so what's great about at least the two new vaccines, and actually Johnson & Johnson vaccine as well, is they all prevent severe illness because they make a lot of antibodies. And this is why the CDC recommends, even if you had COVID, you should still get the immunization, because you might have just had a mild case and not have that many antibodies. And it is known that you can get infected again, even though you were infected once before. So it's not like measles at all. Measles is a great one to treat with immunizations because you get the shot and bam, you are immunized the rest of your life. I'll just say one more thing and then we'll have time for questions. There's a lot of talk right now about the variants. You know, there's a UK variant, a South Africa variant, a Brazil variant, and there's a lot unknown about it. This is a disease. It's one of the things that's been so interesting to me is how fast it changes and why it's so important to keep up. So we don't know a lot about it, but it does appear that the vaccines are effective against the variants to some degree, but they may not be as effective as before, as to the original variety. It does seem like the new varieties might be more effective. They may be more deadly, but we don't know that for certain. But they appear to infect people more easily than the original variant did. I think I'll stop there and see if you have any questions.
Okay. And I'm going to move it over then to
Oh,
gallery
let
view.
me do say one thing, because this is a
Okay.
common question. It is recommended that you get 2 doses of the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine.
Right.
The new J&J is only 1 dose. So the reason for the 2 doses is that you get about 50% immunity with the first dose, but you get 95% with the second dose. And it is possible that you would get some benefit from only taking 1 dose, but it really is highly recommended to get both doses. And it may be that we're going to need boosters later. We just don't have enough time yet to know whether the immunity lasts longer than 6, 8. It appears that it'll last at least 6 to 8 months because that's as long as it's been tested so far.
So my question is about the boosters. Will there be boosters to overcome the variants? Is that what you're envisioning? Or, I mean, it looks like it's a kind of a vaccine we're going to have yearly, like the flu shot. But in terms of the variants, will we know whether or not there's a booster to protect against the variants?
So Pfizer is working on a booster that's specific to the variants. And so they're doing a lot of work now trying to find out whether there's something they might need to do different about the vaccine, maybe spike protein plus another part of the mRNA. So I think we'll still see a lot of research in the next couple of years looking at that question of whether a booster of the original shot given a year later, like the flu shot is, will be enough, or whether it has to be a different shot to take account of the variants.
Dr. Ken, question. I've heard of the Bam Bam by Eli Lilly. What is that compared to the vaccines that we're getting now?
Yeah, I've only read a little bit about that, so I don't really know that much about it. There's actually about 30 vaccines that are being developed right now. Is that the one from Venezuela?
I'm not sure, but they said that that's something that has to be administered within 72 hours or is not effective. You know what I mean? It's like,
oh, well, that might be antibodies. So a lot of people ask the question, you know, if I get exposed, should I get a vaccine right away? And the answer is no. And the reason is, from the time you're exposed to the time that you develop the infection, whether it's asymptomatic and it's only determined by testing, or symptomatic and you have actual symptoms, that takes 5 days. And then when you get a vaccine, it takes somewhere between 10 and 12 days to get the antibody response. So even if you got vaccinated the next minute after you were exposed to someone, it still you wouldn't have antibodies in time to prevent the infection from occurring 5 days later. So the goal is just get vaccinated. Everybody should just get vaccinated, but the vaccine won't prevent you from getting an infection if you are exposed. Does the vaccine prevent asymptomatic transmission? It does look like it does. 67 they were able to follow by doing tests on people who had gotten the vaccine, and a lot of people got exposed during the time after they got vaccinated. And the conversion in the first after the first 10 days was very small. So the big thing is it significantly prevents, like 95% reduction in deaths and serious cases, but it's about 65% effective in preventing asymptomatic transmission too. So that's really important for getting down the number of people in the community who have it. And surprisingly, like the J&J vaccine, which is only 1 dose, it was more effective in older people than it was in younger people.
Did I hear you say that the vaccine is fully a dead vaccine?
Yeah, it's not a dead vaccine because it was never even alive. So it's incapable of giving you the disease. And many of you are old enough to remember the polio one of the polio vaccines that could give you polio. That's because in the old days, the way they made vaccines was they had the virus, for instance, or the bacteria, and they would kill it using chemicals and then give you kind of the remnants of that killed virus. But there always could be some of the virus left in it. It does not even have the coronavirus infective part in it. It just has the spike protein. So that's for the Moderna or the Pfizer. So you cannot get COVID, which is the disease, from the vaccine. Even the
Oddly,
vaccine.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say
the J&J vaccine. The J&J vaccine is different though, because it uses what's called a viral vector. Vector means a carrier. So what they did was they found a completely non-dangerous, what's called adenovirus. Adenoviruses are everywhere. There are multiple different ones can cause the common cold, but this particular adenovirus doesn't even cause the common cold. And they genetically engineered it to carry the mRNA segment that makes spike protein. So it works the same way by producing antibodies to the spike protein, but you're actually getting a virus. And this one does go into the nucleus of your cells. The mRNA viruses, Pfizer and Moderna, don't even go into the nucleus of the cells. They make the spike protein out in the cytoplasm or surrounding area of the nucleus. Go ahead.
I had asked my primary when I had gone in January, and he had said it was partially live and partially dead. So that was incorrect based on what you said.
That's
so
correct.
Thank you. Does the protein portion that you get from the vaccine cause the symptoms? Because I have a friend who got the chills and a headache for hours, and she couldn't sleep after getting her second dose of Moderna.
It does. And one way to think about it is, the risk is extremely small. The anaphylaxis is the serious allergic reaction where you have blood pressure dropping, severe problems with fever and chills, and very severely ill. It's about 6 per million in the Pfizer's and about 5 per million in the Moderna vaccines. And to give you a similarity, penicillin has a 1 in 5,000 chance of causing anaphylaxis. So it's way less risky for serious reactions. But commonly, people are going to have on the first dose some reaction. I had the mildest, which is just pain at the injection site for 2 days. But a few people will have some headaches or muscle aches or a feeling of tiredness or lethargy. That's about 10% of people. Severe reactions are pretty unknown with the first dose, but they aren't, but more reactions are common with the second dose. About 40%, I have a graph if you want to see it, but about 40% of people have more of a reaction with the second dose. But the way to think about that is that's your body working. That's the different immune system gearing up by producing all the things that should be produced to fight coronavirus. And so, you know, you're not supposed to take ibuprofen or aspirin or anything like that before you get the the vaccine, but you can take that after you've had the vaccine. It may, if you take it before, it may actually interfere with your immune response. But if you take it afterwards, when you've had symptoms, it means your response is already in gear and it's not going to be slowed down by a little bit of Motrin.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Tim, you're muted.
I put a question in the chat, but I'm happy to repeat it.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of us, less for ourselves, but maybe for the next generation, for younger people who have concerns about the long-term and unknown effects of the mRNA platform. Can you address that? And are the concerns warranted?
Yeah, it's hard to know, and also it depends on what you mean by long-term. So the good thing is there's almost no history of long-term effects of other vaccines longer than a few months afterwards. Some of the worst ones, for instance, was with the H1N1 back in the 90s, that it caused something called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a paralysis. But that happened within a month or so after the infection. Personally, I think the long-term effects of COVID are much more risky than the long-term effects of the vaccine. So I'm willing to take that risk. But we have to admit that even though this type of vaccine has been in production and studied scientifically for 10 years, it's still only 10 years. So, and it hasn't been widespread use. So there's a big unknown about it. But we do know this is the most significant killer since 1918 that we've ever faced. And so that's why I just take the risk and say, I'm going to take the risk of the vaccine over the risk of getting it at my age, 72, and having a bad outcome.
So just to follow up, would the long-term effects be genetic? I mean, could there be a genetic reorganization in some way that we aren't aware of?
It's unlikely, and that's because the mRNA does not enter your nucleus. So, we have, in the nucleus of the cell, we have DNA, and DNA is what is crucial to life. It makes all of our proteins. But what happens is the DNA spreads apart, mRNA connects, all the nucleotides connect to the half of DNA, and then it pulls off, that's called mRNA, and then it leaves the nucleus and goes out to what's called the mitochondria. And the mitochondria are the protein factories. That's where everything is made protein-wise. And proteins really are the main building block of our bodies. So it never enters the nucleus. It only enters the mitochondria to make the spike protein. And long-term genetic consequences then are theoretically impossible because we are not letting it into our DNA. mRNA doesn't make DNA, but DNA makes RNA.
So if the J&J goes into the nucleus, would it be more apt to have long-term genetic effects?
Possible. It is a piece of mRNA going in. It's thought that probably you have somewhere between 4 and 7%, all humans have 4 and 7% of our DNA comes from viruses. It was brought into our bodies and now became part of the human genome. It's passed on to your children. It's part of what we think of as being human. So the concept of viruses getting into our DNA is not new. It's been going on since the beginning of human evolution. So I don't think there's any reason to think that that the adenovirus that they're giving that carries the RNA in it would cause any long-term genetic changes in us. But again, we don't know for certain.
Can I ask
Yeah.
I have a question about when do you think the vaccine is going to be ready for children?
Probably not until after the summer, I think. You know, we've got, I don't know, each state is somewhat different, which is a controversy in public policy, but generally the pattern is you give it to healthcare providers and nursing home, assisted living residents and staff. There's a whole social discussion about that because there's been a lot of vaccine hesitancy by nursing home staff, which is very worrisome. Then it's given to people who are 65 and so-called essential workers like grocery store clerks and people like that, and then to the general population and then to children. So it's pushing it back to, you know, late summer before it will be available for children. Probably that's okay because children don't get infected as much. They don't have as many ACE2 receptors. When they do get infected, they usually don't get very sick. And so putting them off to last, while it might sound heartless, I think is actually good public policy.
But
we ought to get the teachers.
The trials haven't been completed for children yet, have they?
No, and right now Pfizer is only down to 16 years old and Moderna is recommended only to 18 years old. So there are trials ongoing right now with children to make sure they're safe. And yeah, I think that there'll be a few months before they're completed. But even if they are completed, I think given the numbers of vaccines that we're going to need, it'll take until summer to get down to them.
Thank you.
Ken, as a follow-up to what Julie just asked, what are the drawbacks to the vaccines about this whole business of keeping them at sub-zero temperature? And I'm thinking of Florida's, or of Texas, since several of you were talking about Texas being out of power and kids in colleges running to get the vaccines while they were still viable. But can you talk about that?
Yeah, so the Pfizer vaccine requires it being stored at -70 degrees, and most hospitals even, and especially doctors' offices, don't have refrigerators that go that low. So the hospitals had to buy special refrigerators, public health departments. It was a significant hindrance to widespread use of the vaccine. The Moderna requires -70, which is a more common scientific refrigerator. And most hospitals have that, and some doctors' offices did, and some public health departments. So both of them, though, had hindrances to rapid spread. The J&J vaccine doesn't require, it can be stored at room temperature. So that's a benefit of it, even though it's a little less effective. So yeah, it'll be an issue as we try and get it rolled out there because of that requirement.
Good, thank you.
But unfortunately, even if you're in a really snowy area like Boston, it's not going to be cold enough to preserve the vaccine. Bruce?
So yeah, first, thank you for doing this for Joyce, and it's an honor to have you here. You've done incredible work over your career, so thank you. I was musing a little with my unscientific brain as you were talking about all the learning that's going on with COVID, and thinking about the virus theory on Alzheimer's and whether we're learning anything out of this that might be applicable to the virus theory, since I think there's been some advance in recent years looking at herpes simplex or other viruses like that as having induced the amyloid production that becomes so detrimental and creates Alzheimer's. So I'm wondering if there's anything that we're learning that will impact the Alzheimer's research that's been going on in that area?
I think the research will continue, and we should see more as time goes on. But frankly, right now, the health system has been so occupied in just treating all of the people who needed treatment that research around associated problems has been wanting. So for instance, we know that, I could show you a slide if we want to switch over, that the presence of chronic conditions significantly increases the risk of dying from COVID, and dementia is one of those chronic conditions. What we don't know is, because these aren't clinical tests, they're observational tests. And observational tests in geriatrics are always dangerous. The old joke in geriatrics is usually an observational test is called a cohort study. So you look at a group of people at one time and you see what they look like and you try and determine what's the cause. But you're not really testing anything. You're just looking at who's present. And so the old joke in geriatrics was, if you believe cohort studies, then you have to believe everybody in Miami is born Hispanic and dies Jewish.
That's not true.
Populations of births and deaths. So we don't know yet. It is known that dementia is a very powerful risk factor for death, but it also may be that those people with dementia who died from COVID were also the frailest, and that the frailty factor was just as big a factor as the dementia was, or even bigger. So yeah, it will be interesting to see how things play out, as now that we're starting to see a decline, and hopefully we won't see, in the great influenza epidemic in 1918 pandemic, there were 3 waves. And we hope there won't be a 3rd wave. It looks like we're going down on the 2nd wave now. Maybe that'll give time to do other important research like the one you're bringing up.
I
Dawn?
wanted to ask a question about a very controversial figure with the Children's Defense Fund, and that's Robert Kennedy Jr.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sorry, having been a Kennedy fan for a long time, I'm sorry that he's taken that approach. The whole subject of anti-vaxxers and that, there was a giant demonstration in Los Angeles at Dodger Stadium to stop people from getting their vaccines. It's part of the era we live in right now of misinformation, and there's a lot of misinformation about the vaccines out there, that it can cause the disease, that it was, that it involves putting in, what do you call those implants, chips, microchips in your body. A lot of kind of weird ideas out there. So, he still quotes the autism studies. That has been conclusively shown not to have been true. The guy who faked that study has, removed himself from science. It's a tough one because he's got a prominent voice, and it's hard to go against. Meg.
Hi, it's great to see you, have you. Yeah, follow up to that question. It's hard for me to believe this, but I have a sibling who is one of these very suspicious people, and she thinks she's gonna protect herself, and she has comorbidities, really serious, with ivermectin. Have you ever heard that? And what would you say?
That's been shown in an RCT, a randomized control trial, not to be effective. It's a drug that actually I used a lot in my nursing home patients because it's an effective anti-scabies drug. And scabies, is a mite that gets under the skin and is terrible in nursing homes because it just spreads like wildfire. So they tried a bunch of different things. The remdesivir does appear to be helpful in hospitalized patients only. It doesn't prevent it. The hydroxychloroquine, that has been shown conclusively not to be beneficial and to be harmful. Of course, bleach and UV light in your body never was been tested. Whether a controversy is around vitamin E, vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc. I just saw a randomized control trial for vitamin C and zinc that didn't show any benefit in preventing it, and didn't show any shortening of the duration of symptoms in people who got it. Vitamin D may be beneficial, but it appears to only be beneficial if you are low in it. So if you're low in vitamin D, then getting up to a normal level may prevent you from catching it. You know, we all get exposed. All of you probably have been exposed, even if you've been careful. But fortunately, and I'm guessing, you didn't get it. So some of us get exposed but don't get it. And that's interesting to think about too. Why is that? That our immune systems are even strong enough to not allow it to take hold and make antibodies. So if you have antibodies, you got it. That meant you had the disease in your body. The body recognizes it as foreign, and your immune system reacted by making antibodies. So the rate of antibody production, though, as I said, the biggest problem is since 45% of people get it and are asymptomatic, they don't know they had it, and they make low levels of antibodies. And so they're really not protected. They don't even know they had it, and they're not protected. And that's why it's wise for everyone to get immunized. Ingo.
Ingo.
Hi, Ken. How you doing?
Hi.
Good.
Good.
I wanted to ask you to do a little forecasting for us and to see when normalization or the new normal or what the future looks like as we go forward in the year 2002 and so forth.
Yeah, that's been really difficult. I had scheduled for March next month to go back to Panama as we do every year. We canceled that trip. We thought about doing it in May when the students have another break that they could go down, but we canceled that one just this week. I was scheduled to do a hike around Mont Blanc in September, and we decided we're going to put that off till next year. I think that things will be much better by the end of the summer, but that we will still need to be careful. And, you know, even if you get your 2 immunizations or the one with J&J, you're still recommended that you should mask and avoid public places and all until we can get 75 to 80% of the population immunized. That means the small percentage of people who get moderate to serious infections and hopefully still go ahead and get their immunization, plus everybody else immunized by a vaccination before we're really safe. So I think it's going to be September, October. It'll be the beginning of next year before we're back to a relatively normal situation. I hope what it means is that when people get sick, we will do what they do all the time in Hong Kong and Japan and all. You wear a mask if you go outside. We have learned a lot. And unfortunately, the CDC and WHO made some missteps at the beginning about masks, but they have fixed that and they understand the value of wearing masks for prevention of spread, not for the prevention of catching it. And so hopefully we'll all get into that habit. And that'll be the new normal. Julie.
So I have a quick question. So I don't know if you heard about a day or 2 ago, Osterholm came out with a prediction that we're going to see the number of cases rise dramatically again over the next 6 to 14 weeks because of the new variants.
Right.
Do you hold any credence to that? Or, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it is a worrisome possibility, but as I mentioned before, some of the early data about the vaccines are that it may prevent infections with the variants as well. So we may not get that kind of model, I think, is based upon the idea that the vaccine will not be effective at all, and that will have similar to the jump we had in November, December, a similar kind of jump again. But I think that the vaccine will make a difference in that, and we'll probably get a rise out of a combination of not everybody getting vaccinated and people getting sick and tired of doing all their prevention activities. And so we'll see another bump, but I hope it won't be as big or as long as this second one was.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Dr. Ken, so should we buy Moderna or Pfizer? No, I'm just kidding.
So I watched a video today actually of someone who was talking about that, and he had a good answer, was get the first one you can get.
You were talking about the stock, right, Tim?
Yeah, that's
okay, yeah.
It's too late.
It's too late. Okay.
Do you buy with Bitcoins?
Yeah.
Dr. Ken, can you help us? Because part of it is we're kind of risk averse, but really it's a matter of risk management. Can you help us when we talk to people in terms of how to make decisions on this, how to help our brain sort of process it in a simple way so that we don't panic, we make good decisions, and hopefully we also don't make other people panic just because of the way we talk. I love the way you talk, but I know I can't talk like you do, so.
Well, I mean, I think there's kind of a variety of questions in that question. So one is, how do I deal with my friends who have vaccine hesitancy? I think the thing to do is to listen more than talk. So ask them why you're worried about it. And then when they give you the answer, say, what else? And then when they give you an answer, say, what else? Until they've exhausted their worries about it. Then if you feel equipped, and you could go on the CDC site and they have one whole site on myths, you could clarify those myths. But there's a thing that we use in medicine called motivational interviewing, where the question in medicine is, how do you motivate people to change their behaviors? And what's been found is that what doesn't work is saying, you need to stop smoking. Right. Telling people what to do doesn't work, because there's a natural reaction, where people, well, what are you telling me what to do? In fact, they often do the opposite. So the best thing is to ask questions. So I think, I would say if they give you a bunch of answers that include some of the myths, like you can get the virus from the vaccination, I would ask a question first and say, well, are you the kind of person who's interested in hearing some information about it, or what would work for you to feel more comfortable with it? And if they say, well, I would like some more information, then give them the information, because that means their mind is already primed to be able to hear it, and that will be likely to change their mind on it. The other one is to appeal to, if you can, because of your connection, appeal to your friendship or love for them. So, saying for those of us who are old enough to have older children, when they're, my sons are 30 and 28, when it becomes available for them. Now, I don't think either of them has hesitancy, but if they did, I would say, I'd really like you to think about doing this for me. So it isn't so much for you, but for me, it would really help if you did this. If you have grandchildren, the same thing. This will allow us to have visitations again and that sort of thing. I think approaching it that way, just direct confrontation and telling them that they ought to rethink this because they're being stupid and selfish, doesn't work. It usually just drives them further away.
Excellent, thank you.
Wouldn't have been nice to hear that about 20 years ago.
Yeah. Unfortunately, doctors weren't taught that 20 years ago, because motivational interviewing has only been around for about 10 years. And a lot of doctors don't know motivational interviewing either.
That's true. Okay, I think we've come to the magic hour. It's actually 5 after 5, and we want to be respectful of everybody's time, especially Ken's. So thank you, Ken, from all of us. This has been, I don't know if you've been seeing the messages coming through, amazingly informative, insightful, and you just make it so easy to understand and cut through all the jargon and be able to have all of us really get what you're saying. And so we thank you
Right.
very much.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Ken.
Thanks.